The lights of the Pacific were fading one by one. On charred islands, where the wind smelled of gunpowder and blood, the Japanese Empire retreated step by step, never admitting defeat. It was the summer of 1945, and the whole world seemed to breathe in silence, like a wounded animal about to take its last breath. American ships surrounded the archipelago like a floating wall. Above the water, the reflection of the grey clouds mingled with the steel of the fleets and the smoke from the wreckage of Okinawa. The war was coming to an end, but no one yet knew at what cost. In the cold halls of the Pentagon, the air was no less heavy than in the trenches. Maps of Japan covered the walls, marked with red lines indicating possible invasion points: Kyushu, Honshu, Tokyo. Around an oval table, the generals gathered. Their voices were low, but each word seemed to carry the weight of thousands of lives. General Marshall kept his gaze fixed on the map, his fingers tracing the route of an invasion that seemed inevitable. "If we invade," he said in a deep voice, "we'll lose more than 500,000 men, maybe more." On the other side, Admiral Leahy crossed his arms. "Japan will not surrender, not while the Emperor lives. They will fight to the last peasant." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of a fan blade spinning slowly, uselessly against the heat and the weight of the decision. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, men awaited orders. On the beach off Okinawa, Sergeant Miller wrote a letter that would never be sent. He spoke of home, of a son he didn't know, and of the fear he felt of setting foot on the next island. "If they say we have to go into Japan," he wrote, "then I hope God is there first." The rain fell lightly on the helmets, washing away the blood mixed with mud. The wind carried rumors that the war was nearing its end, but also that something terrible was being prepared. In Washington, the early morning hours were heavy. Truman, newly arrived in the presidency, walked alone in the Oval Office. He had inherited not only a war, but a secret. In a leather briefcase, marked only with the word "Top Secret," the greatest power ever conceived by man slept within him. They called him Manhattan Project. Truman had opened it for the first time days before in a discreet meeting. General Groves had spoken with military precision, describing in a monotone voice what was, in essence, the birth of a new son. "Mr. President," he had said, "a single bomb could destroy an entire city." The room fell silent. Truman looked out the window, where the dawn was painting the sky red, and asked softly, "And what will be left then?" On the other side of the world, in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito lived surrounded by shadows. The palace, once a symbol of imperial divinity, was now a haven of silence and fear. Japanese generals spoke of honor, but the people already knew hunger. Cities burned under incessant bombardment. The sound of B-29s had become as familiar as the chirping of cicadas in summer. In Kyoto, ancient temples trembled under the echo of the explosions. In Hiroshima, children drew airplanes on the ground with sticks, never imagining that in a few weeks, the sky itself would become their enemy. Back in the United States, the discussions intensified. Some generals advocated for the invasion. "Japan needs to be occupied to understand defeat," said General MacArthur. He saw the islands not just as targets, but as symbols. Their honor demands direct surrender, but others looked at the statistics with horror. General Marshall knew that every kilometer of Japanese beach would be defended to the last man. The projections were brutal. 500,000 Americans dead, perhaps 1 million Japanese. And on the margins of that calculation, someone whispered the word that would change the century pipe. Tension spread like invisible smoke through the corridors of power. In the basement of Los Alamos, scientists in white coats discussed not equations, but morality. The physicist Oppenheimer walked through the rooms like a man condemned to know his own sin before committing it. "We have become death," he murmured, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, "the destroyer of worlds." On the president's desk, reports piled up. Photos of Hiroshima and Tokyo, reduced to ashes by conventional bombing, proved that Japan was still resisting. The Japanese High Command was preparing civilians, women, children, the elderly, to fight with bamboo spears. Japan was not going to surrender, and Truman knew that each day of war cost thousands of lives in the Pacific and occupied Asia. On the morning of July 16th, in the Alamogordo Desert, the sun rose twice. The first time, naturally. The second time, artificially, terribly human. A white flash tore across the horizon, and the wind from the explosion blew like the breath of a god who had decided to show his fury. The test had worked. The bomb was real. But no one in the experimental field celebrated. The silence after the explosion was too heavy to be filled with applause. Oppenheimer looked at the mushroom cloud and thought, now everything has changed. The world will never be the same again. In Washington, a new meeting was called. Truman arrived silently, his gaze distant. The generals rose in a sign of respect, but he merely nodded and sat at the head of the table. "We have a weapon that can end the war," he said, his voice firm, without emotion. But at what price? General Groves explained the details. The primary target would be Hiroshima, an industrial and military city, then perhaps Nagasaki. Admiral Leahy shook his head. "Mr. President, using that weapon would be barbaric. We have already defeated Japan. There is no need to destroy women and children." Truman remained silent. Outside, the distant sound of a light rain pattered against the windows, as if the sky itself were hesitating. The dilemma grew. Invading Japan meant plunging back into hell, every hill, every city, defended with fanaticism. But dropping the bomb, that was something beyond war. It was crossing a threshold from which humanity might never return. And in that room, while the generals discussed statistics and possibilities, none of them could have foreseen the silence that would follow. A silence that only exists when even the air seems to lament what man has been able to create. The world breathed in anticipation. In the Pacific, planes remained on alert. In American factories, steel continued to be molded into tanks and bombers, even as everyone knew the war was drawing to a close. It was as if no one dared to stop, as if incessant movement was the only way to avoid facing the abyss that opened before humanity. Truman walked through the corridors of the White House in the twilight of the early morning. The walls seemed to whisper memories of Lincoln, Roosevelt, men who had borne the weight of a nation at war. Now it was his turn to decide, to invade and see an ocean of bodies rising on Japanese beaches, or to launch a weapon that no one has ever seen and that perhaps no one should ever see. The news of the successful nuclear test had arrived hours earlier. The words were technical, almost cold. The device operated as expected, releasing more energy than any known explosive. But what those phrases concealed was the birth of a new era. The fire that once belonged only to the gods was now in the hands of weary men of generals who had lost sons of scientists who hadn't slept for months, of a president who knew that any decision would haunt him until the end of his days. In Tokyo, the emperor's advisors met in silence. General Anami still spoke of resistance, of honor, of dying fighting. 1 million men await on the beaches. The American invasion will be met with the blood of the faithful. But even he knew the country was exhausted. The cities were smoldering ruins. The people lived on roots and burnt rice. Mothers sold what little they had left to bury their children. And on dark nights without electricity, the sky lit up with the distant reflection of the fires. Japan was an empire of shadows. Meanwhile, in Potsdam, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin met. The fate of the world rested on that table. The American president received a discreet note, a few words, almost innocent. "The baby is born successfully." He read, closed his eyes, and then resumed speaking to Stalin, disguising the weight of the news with a studied calm. But inside him, something had changed. He knew he possessed a final card, a force that no other man on the planet could comprehend. Back in the United States, the meetings became daily. In each one, the voices seemed more tense, the pauses longer. General Marshall defended the military logic. Invasion would be inevitable if Japan did not surrender. "Unconditional surrender is our goal, Mr. President, nothing less." But Secretary Stimson spoke in a different voice, deep, almost prophetic. "Sir, the use of this bomb will not only be a decision of war, it will be a decision about the kind of civilization we want to be." No one answered. The lights flickered. The clock on the wall marked the passing of the hours, as if time itself awaited a choice. In Los Alamos, the scientists remained silent. Some requested that the bomb only be demonstrated, dropped into the sea in front of Japanese observers. Perhaps the mere warning would be enough to end the war, they suggested. But the military voices were stronger. Japan needed to see, it needed to feel power. And at its core there was another motivation, a silent warning not to Japan, but to the Soviet Union. The post-war world was already taking shape in the shadows. In the early morning of July 25th, Truman signed the order. His handwriting was firm, but his heart hesitated. The use of this new weapon is intended to be directed against a Japanese military installation, surrounded by workers and soldiers. The ink dried slowly on the paper. Outside, the night wind rustled through the trees, and the president sensed that somewhere far away, a new era was beginning to breathe. In the Pacific, Colonel Tibbets received secret orders. The plane, a modified B-29, was named after his mother, Enola Gay. He looked at the silver fuselage reflecting the rising sun, and thought that in a few hours, the whole world would know that name. At the base, the air smelled of fuel and fear. The pilots avoided looking each other in the eye. They all knew they were about to do something that surpassed human comprehension. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima, the morning of August 6th began like any other. The sun rose over the Otter River, reflecting on the tranquil waters. Children went to school. Women carried buckets of water. Wounded soldiers cleared rubble. The temple bell rang at 8 a.m. No one knew that. Thousands of meters above, the sound of engines was approaching. Slow, steady, distant enough not to cause alarm. No interior do Enola Gay the bomb lay there like a sleeping heart. On its metal surface, someone had written by hand, "Little boy." Tibbets kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. "May God have mercy on us," murmured the co-pilot. At 8:15 a.m., the compartment opened. For a few seconds, the bomb fell silently. A small, dark dot descending toward a city that was still waking up. Then came the light. A white flash, so pure and terrible that it extinguished all the colors in the world. The ground rose up. The air screamed. Time stood still. Hiroshima disappeared. In the following minutes, a column of fire and dust rose into the sky, forming a mushroom cloud visible for miles. The shadows of the bodies remained etched on the walls. The hot wind carried screams, dust, and memories, and then silence. A silence that seemed to last forever. In the Pacific, the radios went silent. In Washington, confusing messages began to arrive. Truman heard the first report at 10 a.m. "Mr. President," said an official, "Hiroshima no longer exists." He took a deep breath. "And Japan?" No response. But the Japanese did not surrender. Even after Hiroshima, the High Command insisted, "Honor demands resistance." The Emperor remained silent. Some generals were planning an internal coup to prevent any surrender. The Americans, receiving no response, prepared a second mission. 3 days later, the boxcar he set off towards Kokura, but the clouds changed his course. Nagasaki slept beneath fog and mountains. At 11:02 a.m., the second sun rose. The city was engulfed in light, and the world finally understood that it had crossed an invisible threshold. In Washington, silence fell once more on the generals' table. None of them celebrated. Marshall lit a cigarette that trembled between his fingers. Leahy looked at the floor and no one dared to speak. "Gentlemen," Truman said, "the war is over." But none of them believed it immediately. The air seemed too heavy for words. Victory. The sound of the radio echoed faintly through the ruins. Distorted voices, news that no one understood. In Japan, the air was heavy with ash and disbelief. Hiroshima had ceased to exist, but few knew what had really happened. Some said it was a gas explosion. Others spoke of divine punishment. The survivors, blind and burned, walked aimlessly, like shadows searching for their own bodies. In the following hours, telegrams began arriving at the Imperial Palace. Fragmented reports, words written in trembling handwriting, total destruction, fire from the sky. City vanished. The advisors gathered in silence. General Anami, the same one who had spoken in honor, trembled as he held the charred leaves. "It's impossible," he whispered. "No human weapon could do this." But it could, and the world would never be the same. Emperor Hirohito remained seated, gazing out at the palace garden. The breeze stirred the cherry blossom petals, and for a moment he pondered what remained of Japan. Deep down, perhaps he knew the war had been lost long ago. But now, for the first time, I understood the price of continuing. In Washington, Truman received the final report. Hiroshima, 80,000 dead instantly. The president looked out the window at the silent White House lawn. The August sun shone, but there wasn't enough light to dispel the weight on his soul. He had called his advisors again. General Groves spoke of success, of military efficiency, of a swift end to the war. But Stimson remained silent, his eyes downcast. "Mr. President," he finally said, "the world will know. And when it knows, what will we say we were that day?" Truman didn't answer. He simply stood up, walked to the window, and said, almost in a whisper, "We'll say we tried to save lives, even if nobody believes us." In the days that followed, tension in Tokyo reached its breaking point. The city was still reeling from previous attacks, and now the entire country awaited the next flash. Many believed that America would destroy every city one by one. In the palace, the Supreme War Council was divided. Some demanded to continue fighting. Others, finally, admitted the need for surrender. It was then that the emperor spoke, in a voice that was rarely heard. "We must endure the unbearable," he said. "We must accept what cannot be accepted." The words sounded like the end of an era. On August 14, 1945, a broadcast was prepared. For the first time in history, the emperor would speak directly to the people. In the makeshift studio, the air was thick. The sound of the spinning vinyl, the clicking of the microphone, the heavy breathing of the technicians. Hirohito adjusted his uniform, looked at the microphone, and began to speak. His voice was calm, distant, almost ethereal. "The enemy has used a new and terrible bomb. The suffering is great. We must pave the way for lasting peace." In destroyed homes, entire families gathered around rusty radios. Many wept without fully understanding the words, but they grasped the tone. Japan had surrendered. Across the ocean, in Washington, the announcement arrived in waves of restrained emotion. In the streets, crowds shouted, danced, and kissed. The sound of bells filled the air. But inside the Pentagon, the celebrations were muted. The generals knew that victory had a bitter taste. Marshall stayed in his office late into the night. Before him lay maps, reports, endless lists of the dead. He lit another cigarette, stared into space, and murmured, "We won, but we lost something we'll never have again." Across the hall, Leahy wrote in her diary, "Civilization has been dishonored on this day. The bomb was unnecessary." But the world didn't want to hear it. The joy in the streets drowned out any moral doubt. In Los Alamos, Oppenheimer received congratulatory telegrams. He did not reply. He walked to a nearby hill and observed the night sky. The wind was blowing cold. He remembered the explosion in Alamogordo, the flash, the silence, the dust rising to infinity. Now I understood that that moment had been the breaking point for humanity. Later, speaking to Truman, he would say in a low voice, "I feel like I have blood on my hands." Truman looked at him impatiently. "The blood is on the Japanese hands, not yours," he replied. But when Oppenheimer left the room, the president was left alone and murmured, "May God forgive me." In Japan, the post-war period began before the dust had settled. Hiroshima had become a land of shadows. The ruins smoldered, and silent figures emerged from among them, survivors who seemed to have returned from another world. They called Ushibakusha those affected by the explosion. Some wandered around with pieces of cloth covering their faces, others dug with their hands in search of relatives. The wind carried the metallic smell of death, and from the ashes a flower sprouted, a small, solitary white flower that grew where before there had only been fire. In the following months, American soldiers landed in Japan not as conquerors, but as ghosts. They marched through ruined cities where children watched them silently. Not a single shot was fired. Japan had surrendered completely. MacArthur took command of the occupation. He walked through the streets of Tokyo with a fixed gaze, aware that he was treading on the border between victory and guilt. He met the emperor at the palace, an encounter that seemed more like a dream than a historical event. Two men, symbols of opposing worlds, face to face. The general looked at Hirohito and saw not a god, but a tired man with trembling hands. The emperor gave a slight bow. "I assume full responsibility for my subjects," he said. MacArthur nodded. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. In the silence of that room, the 20th century was changing shape. The sound of bombs had ceased, but within each man who had lived through that era, something continued to echo. The distant hum of white light, the glare that erased the boundaries between guilt and necessity. The war was over, but the peace that emerged was not pure. It was a peace built upon the memory of fire. In the United States, Truman spoke to the people on the radio. His voice was firm, serene, almost pastoral. "This is the victory of freedom over tyranny. God bless America." But when the microphone was cut off, he remained silent for long minutes, staring into the darkness of the room. That night, he dreamed of cities in flames and woke up sweating, with the taste of ash in his mouth. In Los Alamos, the scientists continued their calculations, but now something had changed. They no longer worked with enthusiasm, but with fear. They knew that the equations they had solved once could destroy the entire world the next time. And in Moscow, Stalin smiled silently, ordering the creation of his own nuclear program. The cycle had begun again. The war ended, but its sound never faded. It remained like a distant echo, vibrating beneath the surface of the new world. Men rebuilt cities, erected bridges and factories, but nothing they did was enough to silence what they had seen. Humanity had learned to survive the fire, and perhaps only that. In Hiroshima, autumn arrived slowly. The burnt trees began to sprout again, timidly, as if hesitating before the light. Among the ruins, survivors helped each other with wounded hands. There was silence, but also something akin to faith, the same faith that endures even when God seems absent. The church bells rang again, not in celebration, but in remembrance. Each chime was a call to memory, a reminder that war does not end when the shooting stops, but when the soul finally accepts what man was capable of doing. Time passed, and the cities were reborn. Cast iron, concrete, glass, all rebuilt upon ashes. Hiroshima became a symbol, Nagasaki a warning. Children returned to running through the streets, but the ground beneath their feet still held vestiges of an invisibly burning past. Sometimes, the wind that came from the river carried a distant smell of smoke, and the elders would close their eyes, remembering the morning when the sun fell from the sky. In the United States, newspapers called it a victory. Schools taught that the bomb ended the war, but in the homes of veterans, the word victory sounded empty. General Marshall retired quietly. He rarely spoke of the war, and when he did, it was with a tone of lament. "There's no glory in killing so quickly," he would say, "only haste in forgetting." Admiral Leahy never forgave himself. In his diary, he wrote for the last time, "I fear that one day man will discover that his greatest achievement was also his downfall." Oppenheimer returned to books, but knowledge was no longer a refuge. His mind carried the sound of the flash, a sound no one else heard but one that would accompany him until his last day. In lectures, he spoke in a trembling voice about responsibility, power, and regret. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence and stare into the void, as if seeing the white light swallowing the desert again. He knew that the real enemy was not the bomb. It was the man who had dreamed of it. Truman lived the rest of his life with the look of someone who hasn't slept completely. In speeches, he defended his decision. It was necessary, he said. It saved lives. But when the crowds applauded him, his eyes seemed to search for something that no longer existed. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps meaning. In recent years, when walking through the gardens, he would sometimes say to himself, without anyone hearing, "No man should have this power." And then the world entered a new era. An era where silence between nations was worth more than words, where peace was maintained not by trust, but by fear. Entire cities began to live under the shadow of a power that no one dared to use, but everyone knew existed. Children learned to hide under desks, the skies filled with invisible planes, and the planet learned to breathe cautiously. The war was over, but the fear had become permanent. In Asia, Japan rose from the ashes with quiet dignity. Temples were rebuilt, rivers purified, squares filled with flowers, but an invisible wound remained. Every August 6th, the sound of the bells echoed again over Hiroshima. The same bell, the same sound, repeated to remind the world of the day when light brought darkness. And with each touch, it seemed as if the entire planet stopped for a second, as if time itself observed a minute of silence. On one of those days, decades later, a boy was walking with his grandmother through Peace Park. She was showing him the charred dome that had remained standing, the last vestige of a city that had witnessed hell. "What happened here, Grandma?" She gazed at the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the hills. "Man has forgotten who he is," she replied, "and for a moment he tried to be God." On the other side of the world, in the desert where it all began, the wind still blows over Alamogordo. The dunes hold the white dust of the first test. The soil still glows under certain lights, traces of the fusion, marks of what man created when he tried to conquer his own fear. At night, when the moon illuminates the sands, it seems possible to see, for a brief moment, the shadow of the mushroom forming again, not as a threat but as a reminder, a warning whispered in the wind. Power that knows no limits also knows no turning back. The invisible narrator of history, the one who saw empires fall and cities rise again, now speaks only in silence, because there aren't enough words to describe what was seen. The bombs exploded decades ago, but the real detonation continues, within man, within the conscience that still seeks to justify the unjustifiable. And perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of war, the awareness that victory and destruction can reside in the same gesture, the same decision, the same touch of a pen on paper. The sound of sirens ceased, the planes took off, the world moved on. But somewhere, deep within time, the voices of the generals still echo in that closed room, debating the impossible: invade or drop the bomb, save us or destroy. And no one will ever know if, at that moment, humanity chose the end, or merely postponed its own beginning. The wind is blowing across the Pacific again. The foam of the waves slowly covers the remains of the battles. The sea, indifferent, whispers the same thing it whispered to the dead and the living. Everything will calm down. Everything comes back around. And man, weary of his own power, continues to seek redemption among the ashes. The final sound is the bell of Hiroshima, a long, pure note, cutting through the silence like a ray of light. After that, only the distant echo remained, the echo of a world that, upon discovering the power of the gods, finally understood the price of being human.